All right. We're going to get started this evening with a scripture reading and a prayer. And do you care to lead us in the prayer, Elijah? You all right? All right. Before he leads us in the prayer, I'll get one of you guys to read Psalm 104, 5 through 9. Who wants to do that? Jonathan?
You established the earth upon its foundation, so that it will not totter forever and ever. You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose, the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth.
So the things that we're going to talk about today, I think we have a depiction in this psalm of maybe a recording of the moment upon which these things occurred. The mountains rising up, the valleys sinking down, and the fact that water was at one point very prevalent upon the earth. Everywhere you look, it seemed like you found it. So we'll look at some things today that help show some evidences of a global flood as we started talking about last Sunday. So Elijah, I'll let you lead us in an opening prayer.
Dear Lord God, Father in heaven, we pray that today's study goes well and we learn more about your creation. And thank you, Jesus, on the cross for your sins.
Amen. So we talked last time a little bit about the ark and just some things that we noticed about the ark. How would it be possible to fit that many animals? How can you fit all the animals on a boat? All the animals there from the boat. What did we discover the answer was?
Well, the boat was bigger than what we can think of.
The boat was bigger,
Yeah.
but it'd take a boat bigger than the ark to fit all the animals on the earth on it.
Based on the kind.
Based on the kinds. The answer we found is Noah didn't do that. Noah didn't fit all the animals on the ark. He fit two, and not two of every single animal, but two of every single kind. And those kinds would not have to imply that they were mature adult animals either. It's very, very possible that this could have been juvenile animals. The size of the ark is incredibly massive. If you've not had an opportunity to go visit the Ark Museum, just in our backyard in northern Kentucky, it's a really humbling experience. They take a lot of liberties, and I'm sure there's a lot of things that they assume that I'm not sure there's evidence for biblically, but the sheer size of the boat, of the ark, is impressive nonetheless. So a lot of room. We came up with a number somewhere near 250 to 300 semi-truck trailers, full, packed from just one end to the other, can fit inside the decks of the ark. It is suggested that maybe only one or two decks would have been needed for all the animals. The rest of the decking could have been used for waste, storage, and human living. One thing that also comes up during that time is, we'll get to it in a minute. Another aspect that I think shows that there was something that occurred, something that is quite catastrophic in nature, is the Columbia Plateau lava beds. Anybody know where Columbia Plateau is? This region? It is part of our country. Anyone take a stab looking at that?
It would be Washington State.
It's Washington State. So it's up the Pacific Northwest. It covers a couple states up there, but mainly there's a big portion of it's in Washington State. It's over 200,000 square miles of lava beds. They are thousands of feet thick. 200,000 square miles. And this can hardly be explained. We expect to see strata and see layering and throughout the geologic column. This feature can hardly be explained through uniformitarianism, that this happened over a gradual period of time. But a catastrophic event would easily explain this this phenomenon. I am missing a slide. It's annoying me. It's throwing me off. All right, well, the slide that's not up there is about the Karu supergroup. Any takes on where that one's from? By the name, I'm going to guess, you can guess that it's not an American.
How do you spell Karu?
Karoo. So I could be saying it wrong. The Karu supergroup. If you were thinking to yourself, that sounds like South Africa, you'd be right.
No, I was thinking about Cairo.
Cairo, that's a good thought too.
Yeah.
The Karu supergroup. It is the most widespread stratigraphic unit in Africa. It covers a large portion of South Africa. If you're in South Africa, there's a good chance you're standing in this area, and it contains around 800 billion fossils within this area. And they are vertebrate fossils, so they're not, they have a backbone. Many of them were land animals, or at least they were amphibious. They were buried in what appears to be a very rapid succession as well. Now, the number that is threw out, 800 billion, is often attacked because it was hypothesized by two creationist scientists. And so there's a lot of times that number is attacked. There's not that many there. And they admitted that this is an estimate, where it was a hypothesis. But what they were guesstimating, the number, their purpose was not to show how many fossils were there. Their purpose was to point out something that other non-creationist geologists had also discovered in the area, and that is the Karoo fossil bed is extremely rich with fauna, specifically vertebrates, that were buried rapidly. So, it's not just there's 800 billion fossils there. If there's a bunch of fossils there of animals that seem to have died and been buried in rapid succession. What caused that? Over an entire region, not just in a small isolated area. We have similar places within our own country. If anybody, I've never been there, but the fossil dinosaur monument park that's out west.
Are you talking about like the Badlands?
No, I should have wrote it down in my notes. I think it's in maybe Utah. But there are suggested that about 60% of all the dinosaurs that ever walked the earth in this area, almost all of them are represented in this one place. They're all buried and fossilized together, and again, it appears as if it was something that happened quite rapidly, as opposed to something that happened over a great period of time. Again, uniformitarianism would struggle to explain how events like this happen. But a catastrophic event would not have a hard time. And for the great period of time, that was the answer to how do these things occur. Up until the early 1800s, it wasn't just that your average churchgoer believed in catastrophe causing many of these things. Most of your prominent universities, so Yale, Oxford, Harvard, places like this taught catastrophism as a cause for many of the geological and fossil remains that we saw in their day. It wasn't until the Bible really comes under great scrutiny and attack, especially with the putting forward of uniformitarianism and Darwin's theory of evolution, that a lot of that view began to go away and be replaced in universities. Aaron?
I was just going to say that in order for evolution to work in the minds of the evolutionists, you have to have uniformitarianism.
Yes.
It can't work otherwise, because you need these this huge expanse of time to allow evolution to do its work.
Yeah. Yeah, and so on Sunday, we mentioned, whenever you begin talking about abbreviated periods of time, specifically when you start talking about outrageously abbreviated periods of time, 6,000 to 10,000 years, the visceral responses that you receive from people are almost to be expected because, as you just pointed out, time is their creative force for all of their belief system. Their worldview is based upon a faith in large portions of time. And so it really becomes, by proxy, their God that they worship. And whenever just as when someone attacks our God, we may get defensive about that. Now, the difference between their God and our God is our God's going to hold us accountable for the way that we respond to those things. And we need to keep that in mind. But we can understand at least why, when you say, you may have a perfect, great relationship with a coworker, everything's going good, and you just somehow in passing mention that you believe the earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old, and all of a sudden it's like just everything goes out the window. We're ready to, how can you possibly think that? That's foolish. And well, what happened? Well, we stepped on the feet of their deity. So up until the 1800s, that was a very common presentation of a solution to the reason for these formations. Another thing to say about the flood, we mentioned that we would expect when we talked about assumptions in the fossil record, we would expect that if a global flood occurred, it would detail certain things, and things that we would find would be one, smaller and immobile ocean creatures would be found deeper in the record. So as Noah has constructed the ark, and they've gone on, the door's been shut, and it's begun to rain, and the flood deep have been opened up, and the flood waters are rising through these various geological events that are occurring. That would have caused a rapid, it would have stirred up a lot of sedimentation. That would have occurred very quickly. And as that is happening, you can imagine things that don't move around very well, aren't able to escape in turbulent and heavy waters, would be some of the first things to be trapped in that as it all gets stirred up. But as we would go a little bit higher up, we would expect to see larger swimming sea creatures, and then we would find seashore and river animals. And as the waters continue to rise and continue to spread inward, we would find smaller mammals. Then we'd start finding reptiles and amphibians. And then we would finally find the much larger animals, the flying animals, and also the animals that were intelligent enough to go find higher ground. And I would include in that, even though I don't think animal is the right term to use, humans. And that brings up a very good question. Where are their fossils? Where are all the human fossils? This is a challenge that is sometimes brought up. You believe in the flood. You believe that all of these fossils that we see of all of these extinct animals came from this catastrophic event. But you also believe that all of humanity, except for 8 people, died in that event. Where are they? How would you answer that? That's a tough question, I think. And I think it's a valid question. I think one thing we could start in is trying to figure out, what are we talking about in just sheer number size? Can we give some sort of estimate of how many people there were on the earth? We don't know. The Bible doesn't reveal. We've got a handful of genealogies, and if those genealogies, we can make some assumptions off of those, make some estimations. In fact, a lot of people estimate that there may have been as many as 10 to 20 million people. There are some that take that number way higher, but I'm not sure how we could really know. But if we take a number like that, if we say 10 to 20 million people on the earth, that's still a lot of people. And if they're on the earth at the time of the flood at the time of the flood appears, what happens to those people? Well, they die in the flood.
They get eaten.
Some of them, maybe, there's a very good possibility. This all occurs, and I think we get the notion sometimes that just all life was eradicated. There are things that possibly survived. There's a reason God doesn't bring the sea animals onto the ark. there's the assumption that there was sea life that survived the flood. But yeah, there's a very good possibility that some of them maybe were eaten during that. Aaron?
Fossilization is a hard thing to do, and all of the conditions have to be correct for it to happen. So the fossils that we do see are going to be just a very small representation of the entirety of
Right.
flora and fauna on the Earth at the time.
Right. So not every single animal, every single plant, not every single organism was fossilized. So we could assume that not all of humanity is fossilized. But we would also assume that some of them would have died and would have been caught up in all the turbulence and then sucked into the sedimentation as it all settles, and pressure would have squeezed, and we would eventually wind up with a fossil. And if that happened, what we would expect to find is a human fossil in maybe, again, this is built off the assumption of 10 to 20 million people on the earth in that day. We would expect to find a human fossil in every 140 to 280 cubic kilometers of rock. That's based off the fact that we estimate 700 cubic kilometers of fossil-bearing rock. So we find fossils in this much rock. So we divide that by the number of people that we expected to be alive in that day. We get that number. Continue. Let's just take the smaller size of that to make our search grid smaller. 140 cubic kilometers. That's a lot of land. That is a huge portion of land where we might expect to find one fossil. Because as Aaron pointed out, not everybody's going to be fossilized. That makes finding a human remain from the flood not just the needle in the haystack. It's the needle in the hayfield of haystacks. One of these out here maybe has a needle in it. How are we going, are we going to find it? Chances are pretty slim and very, very, very small. Aaron?
As you figure, let's say there were 20 million people living on the Earth, and let's just, since we're throwing numbers out, assume that 1/10 of 1% of those individuals may have been fossilized. That's 20,000 individuals in a volume of 140 to 280 cubic kilometers. That, like I said,
it's extremely small chance of finding a fossil. So, that question gets brought up. The question is brought up with the assumption that, hey, this is going to prove that the flood did not occur. It just proves that human fossils are hard to find. And we know that because human fossils are hard to find. And we've not found tons and tons and tons of human fossils. We have found some. We found the human fossils scattered throughout the earth. But we should not expect that we're going to just be able to go, okay, well, we'll just go and find a fossil of a person living in the day that's going to prove the flood occurred. Because what we're looking for is astronomically small. The chances are very, very low.
With the non-human fossils, that process has been going on even beyond the flood. So we're taking this one moment in time where humans could be fossilized, because I don't think typically humans are fossilized that much, but non-human animals, things like that are. So, I don't know, to me, there's more time for those things to happen, whereas we've just got that one moment in time.
Yeah, it seems like it makes the search field even smaller. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So another thing that gets thrown up as a argument against, maybe not necessarily against the flood, but we believe that the flood created a lot of these geological features that we see. Sometimes people will look at it all and say, oh, okay, that's your mechanism for what you see around you. But you just can't explain to me why it appears so old. Why does the earth appear so old? If I do carbon dating, and we talked about this, we talked about faulty assumptions, but even without that, with those assumptions, we're holding a rock. We're not saying that the rock doesn't look old, we're just saying that it's not old. But why then is it made to appear old? And one answer that we might give for that comes from the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verses 20 through 22. God said, "Let the waters teem with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth in the open expanse of the heavens. God created the great sea monsters and the living creatures that move, with which the waters swarm after their kind, and every winged bird after its kind, and God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, 'Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters and the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth.' There was evening, there was morning, the fifth day." God created life. And then he commanded life to make more life. Be fruitful and multiply. The exact same thing is said in 26 through 28 about man. God made Adam. He made man and woman. And then he told them to procreate. Make more of your... And we know that theologically there's more going on than that. But in a sense he's saying populate the earth. Fill the earth with more people. So... would it be logical that God made an infantile Adam and an infantile Eve? You know how hard I looked for that, by the way, a picture of Adam and Eve as babies walking through the garden? And I just could not find anything that came close to what I was thinking. But could you imagine that? God made Adam and Eve as infants, as toddlers, and said, "I want you to populate the earth." And it's, we're going to have to take a good 20 years before you're ready to start doing that. But God gives them a command. The same command that he gives to the animals. He creates the tree line. He creates the garden. And the garden is made in a state where it starts providing food for creation at that moment. Robbie, how long does it take for... You just started elderberries. Are they fruitful yet?
Well, it's their third year, so.
It's their third year.
Yeah, but you take some just trees that produce acorns or, walnuts or whatever. It takes 20 to 30 years.
Yes. I mean, there is a large passage of time. And so if he's created a garden that is able to sustain life by providing food for it, then he has created a mature garden. If he creates an elephant that it says, you're going to go make more elephants, he's created a mature elephant. I don't care if it looks like it's 50 years old. It's an hour old. Now, the argument that sometimes comes up with this is if God made these things this way, then God must have made the earth this way as well. He made a mature earth, able to sustain life, able to sustain its cycles in balance and ready to go. And the question that sometimes arises is, if God did that, that God seems like a little bit of a liar. He's very deceptive. In fact, a lot of times what you'll hear people say is, you're telling me that God just made the earth and put all these fossils in the ground to trick us? Number one, no, we didn't say that. We didn't say anything about the fossils. We said that he made the earth mature. The fossils, we believe, come from the flood. The flood caused this great event that caused a rapid burying of many things on the earth. But the fact that God made the earth mature, is that deceptive? I don't think that shows a sign of deception at all. I think it shows a sign of rejection. Rejection of the God who told them in the very beginning that I made a mature earth whenever I made it and said, be fruitful and multiply. That is an admission of God. He doesn't come right out and say, I made Adam and he's 33 years old and he is ready for him and his wife to start a family. But he comes right out of the gate saying, this is my creation and this is what I want it to start doing. And that is, at least by inference, an admission that I made them able to do this. So this is God telling us from the beginning what I have done. He is not deceiving us. We are rejecting it. There's a quote in the 1978 publication of American Atheist that says, Christianity has fought, still fights, and will continue to fight science to the desperate end over evolution, because evolution destroys utterly and finally the very reason Jesus' earthly life was supposedly made necessary. Destroy Adam and Eve in the original sin, and in the rubble you will find the starry remains of the Son of God. If Jesus was not the Redeemer who died for our sins, and this is what evolution means, then Christianity is nothing. That was a G. Richard Bozarth. And he hit the nail on the head for why we think this class is important. and why we do study evolution, and why we do hope to give an answer for the reason that is within us, a defense for the hope that is within us. Because this is what evolution attacks at its very core. It attacks the foundations of the truth of our God and our need for His Son and His sacrifice to atone for our sins. And I would not expect someone with such a low view of God to consider His Word. And I'm not surprised whenever this is a quick quip that God must be a deceptive trickster. And God is not worthy of my time. He's not worthy of my admiration. He's not worthy of me considering that He's made the world in this way. Because what people who believe that are also going to tell you is I am not responsible for that God. But it is the very reason why we, knowing that we are, have a need to study and have a need to prepare ourselves to give answers whenever people attack the truth of God's Word. Now, let me clarify what I mean by that when I say give answers when people attack. And I think there is a time and a place for debate, and when done in the right way, when done with the right heart. But I do not mean that we stoop to the same levels as the people around us. As I said at the beginning of class, we believe in a God, and we believe that we're going to have to give an answer to that God. So as we go through this and we kind of take the rest of the material that we have on evolution, as we sort of put everything together to create this picture of what we believe happened and created all that we see, let us make sure that we always use that to say, hey, you may think I am stupid, and you may think that I am a liar and that I am trying to deceive others, and I think that you are somebody worthy of my time, and I love you, and I want to share this truth. And if you don't want to hear it, well, that's fine. And you can think what you want to of me, but what I want you to know is what I believe fits within a worldview that accepts the Bible. And if you can give some moments to consider the evidence of that, and we talked a little bit about that at the very beginning of class, and we likely could spend much more time discussing the evidences of the resurrection of Jesus, the evidences of the success of prophecy, and the things that were said and written hundreds and sometimes 1,000 years before they occurred. If we can talk about that evidence, I think there is ample reason for us to come to have a belief that, at the very least, God's Word is accurate, it's historically reliable, and the things that it's describing give a very good reason for the things that we see in the world around us. We're going to look at some more evidences for a worldwide flood. But before we go on to that, any other thoughts on this point specifically, that the world appears to be mature? All right, so some more evidences for a worldwide flood. Who knows what we're looking at here without me telling you? This is Mount St. Helens. Mount St. Helens. What happened there?
A huge volcanic eruption in 1980.
Huge volcanic eruption. I remember, I was, show my age, I was born in 86. And I still remember seeing footage of this being aired as a kid and being scared of it. Something that happened 6 years before my birth, and being frightened by just the magnitude of what occurred at this location. So the eruption of Mount St. Helens proved something that both creationists and evolutionists agree is possible, and that is the notion of rapid sedimentation. What we are looking at here in this picture is very, very similar to what we see in other places. This is 25 feet of sedimentary layer Uniformitarianism, as you notice, by the way, in this picture, Miss Carol, it looks like you're looking at the edge of a canyon, and there's various layers of sediment that you can see. The picture is kind of a grayish picture. It is in color, but there's different layers of sedimentation. All of that is not the product of tens of millions of years. It's the product of about 6 hours. This portion around Mount St. Helens was formed in the afternoon of its eruption. 25 feet of sediment formed just like that. So if we can have 25 feet of layered sedimentation formed following the eruption of Mount St. Helens in just an evening, what do you think a couple months of a global flood would be able to produce? I mean, this is extremely rapid, and scientists, as I said, creationists alike, have acknowledged that floods and hurricanes and volcanic eruptions, they provide for us what we assume millions of years would be necessary to make. They provide it for us overnight. That is a common and widely accepted occurrence. In research, both creationist scientists and evolutionist scientists have discovered that when various sizes of sediment are mixed together in water, this was a really neat experiment. So when they mixed various sizes of sediment together in water, and then they allowed that sediment to settle, a very strange sort of phenomenon occurred in which it settles in a self-sorted separate layers, regardless of the specific flow rate of the water. So it really doesn't matter what the water's doing. As it settles and it separates itself. And it creates these layers. And they've repeated this on small scale. They've done it on big scale. They've done it by changing the shape of the container to try to simulate avalanches and other various things. And they find a very similar thing happens again and again and again. Now, why that is significant to the creationists, when these tests, when they did these experiments in the 80s, and creationists came out of the woodwork because they were saying that explains these layerings that are found all over the world. It doesn't matter where you go. We find the similar layering. It explains that because what we're seeing is sediment separates itself and it layers itself out by itself, depending upon the sizes of it, depending upon its properties. That occurs whenever sediment is mixed with water. So a global flood would very much give an answer for that. We also see example of it in other places. This is a picture from the Grand Canyon. And if you imagine, this is kind of a grainier picture, but you imagine the Grand Canyon, you have all of those stripes in the canyon walls. And these are our different areas of the geological column. And what we see here is something known as interbedded layers, where you have this Cambrian layer down low. It's kind of a whitish, greenish color, that Cambrian layer down low, and then the Mississippian layer, that is the reddish color above. But if you'll notice, in between all of this interbedded material, where you have both red, the Mississippian, and Cambrian stacked and mixed together. Now these are millions of years separated in formation. The Cambrian came about 150 million years prior to the Mississippi. And so with that, what we should see is very sharp lines that don't blend in any way. And yet there are several occurrences where we see these things. We're going to look at another one in a moment as we see a significant feature that suggests the workings of the flood. But all of this suggests that this sediment that is laid down into these various stratas must have been laid down in a rapid way for it to get mixed up. If it was uniform and over time, we would expect for one to stop and for the next one to begin, and for it to rest upon the other. But with that rapid sedimentation, we would expect to see some overlap and some intermingling of some of that in those areas. Any thoughts on the sedimentation before we move on?
Well, I think we can take a look at a biblical example to demonstrate how, different properties of things are mixed together, it causes them to separate out. Just think about separating wheat from chaff.
Yeah.
Wheat's very heavy, and when you throw it up in the air, the wheat
Yes.
drops, but the chaff floats along and settles down a little
Right.
later, due to differences in the property. And both of those part of the chaff and the wheat are both moving in a fluid. We don't think about the air,
Right.
but
Exactly.
air is a fluid,
Right.
and they behave differently in that fluid. The chaff floats along while the wheat sinks.
Yeah, it's very important.
Yeah, it settles out based on its density.
Right. Yeah.
That's the property that basically settles it out. We used to do a little experiment with a flood in this. I had this container, it had a bunch of different materials. You shake it up and then it settles out. Yeah, I had some pebbles and I had some maybe sand and I had some even finer sediment and
Yeah.
and mud eventually, and it settled out based on its density.
Right.
Just like we see right here.
Exactly what we see right there. Yeah. So here's another great example of evidence of a worldwide flood, and that is polystrate fossils. Now, polystrate comes from the compound word poly, many, and strate, as in sedimentary layers, strata. So we have many sedimentary layers. What you see over here in this picture is a fossilized tree that is standing up through many various, you can kind of see, it's not a very good picture, but you can see different layers of rock in this. A better picture is this one right here, where we see the remains of a fossilized tree that is upright, going through various layers of strata that should have occurred over millions and millions of years. So what we would be led to believe in an instance like this is that this tree died and began being fossilized in stages over millions of years. That tree would have been standing and more of it would have been covered. What happens to trees when they die? They rot. They rot away. We said, for them to fossilize, something has to occur to preserve that or to impress it into its surroundings. And so this is another great example. And while it's not just trees that we see this way, I made the comment about the Tyrannosaurus Rex little cartoon that I had, that we usually find them flat. Sometimes we find animals this way as well. Animals that should not exist over various layers, and yet we find them taking up various layers in the geological column. Another thing interesting about these polystrate trees, this one, you can kind of see the bottom of it, the formation of its root down here, but there are some that are found that are inverted. So the root ball is at the top, and there are some that are found that are laying on their side, and yet they still are in between layers. Instead of just being in one layer, they're taking up multiple layers. If you have ever witnessed this phenomenon happening in, say, a pond or a lake, you will find trees that have died and fallen into the water. And as they float, some of them, while they're still buoyant, will be at the top. Others will begin to take water in on one end or the other, and they will turn, sometimes standing straight up and down, sometimes upside down, just depending on which end of the tree collects more and becomes less buoyant. As you said, the denser parts are going to affect that. And so, this is yet another great example of something that may have occurred while water was covering the face of the earth. Trees have been uprooted and unmoored from their foundation, and as they float throughout the world, they begin to take on enough water to sink. And where they sink, they become entombed in the sediment that is dissipated. Aaron,
There's a lake in Washington,
yes,
down from the Mount St. Helens. It's basically a tree graveyard.
Yes.
I saw a description of it as a coal factory.
Right.
Because you have all these trees laying on the surface, and they eventually settle to the bottom of the lake at different times, depending upon the type of tree.
Right.
And they stand up. And so it looks like a forest under
Under the
trees,
water.
underwater.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's very much what we're seeing here. And the idea is, well, this must have occurred, hundreds of millions of years ago. But if that's the case, it just does not fit into the fact that it is taking up these various layers of the fossil,
Kyle,
of the geological record.
have you done research on coal? How did coal get buried? Or actually, what produces coal is organic
Yes.
material, plants basically. How did all that coal get buried
All the fossil
thousands of feet?
fuel that we have.
All the fossil fuels.
Yeah, and there is a question also about, we see a great deal of fauna, but we don't find near the amount of flora that we find in the fossil record. What happened to all the grass? What happened to all the plants? What happened to all,
It got covered with sediment.
it got covered with sediment, and it got heavy pressures of water that was covering the earth. And that's going to, not only will that generate heat, but that is also going to be added to the heat that is occurring as underwater geysers and volcanoes and tectonic plates and all of this. Again, when I say catastrophe, we need to think end of the world sort of events that are occurring, and all of that is the perfect components to make fossil fuels,
So
as they're trapped underneath all that.
I've had this theory about why we have so much fossil fuel, so much coal. I mean, do you think it's God's intention to have so many dinosaurs and have so many of these plants buried so we today can have the amount of fossil fuels that we do have?
Well, if he did,
He provides everything.
Exactly.
if he did, I wish
Find it.
I wish he'd provide some people to bring the price down of it.
Yes.
You were talking about, the flood being an end of the world sort of scenario. It was.
Exactly.
We have a pre-flood antediluvian world, very different from the world that we have today.
Yeah.
Not only in terms of plants and animals, but just the climate in general.
Yeah.
So you can imagine the shock of Noah and his family. They went into the ark and living in one world, and when they leave the ark, the world is completely different.
Yeah. And it's extremely likely, in fact, it's my belief that it's at this time that we see the makeup of the world that we see today, the continents that we see today, are very likely formed at this moment as the world breaks apart through the events that are occurring. And we'll have some other questions revolving around that very thought. Real quickly before we get to those, so these are folded rocks. Aaron is like, yes, that's what I wanted to talk about. Tell us about folded rocks, Aaron. We know you got 2 minutes.
Well, it's applied on this, your geologist would say, only as pressure and long periods of time, the rocks just somehow miraculously bent without breaking. But a much more logical explanation is that these were muddy sedimentary layers that were laid down, and while they were still muddy and still pliable, you had other forces that were pushing them and prodding them and causing them to fold the way that we see them now.
Yeah, so Miss Carol, what we have are these same layers like we expect to see in the Grand Canyon, those layers, but the layers have ripples in them, almost like the ripples in a river as it flows. And in some places, this one here has a 90-degree bend where the layer turns and goes straight up. And as Aaron said, that is something that could have been done as they were mud. It's also something that could have been done through the heating forces as volcanoes erupt underground, and as these are pliable from all of that heat and yet not liquefied to be dispersed in throughout the water, they are able to be bent. Another great example of this, and you can see the sheer size of this one with this human up here for a figure. And what's interesting about this one is it's the very same sort of thing. We see the bend in the rocks as this layering is jutting down, but this layer to this layer is 145 million years. So somehow this layering was bent, and then as more sedimentation is on top of it, it does not appear that the sedimentation just filled in the area. It appears as if it was bent too, and to Aaron's point, there is no breaking, and they are uniform over 145 million years. the assumption that has occurred is at the very least difficult. But if you have an event like a world flood, it does fit within that view quite well. Another one to think about as we run out of time is the Grand Canyon, supposedly made by the Colorado River. Here's the first problem. What is all around the Grand Canyon? What sort of formation is it upon? Not a mountain.
It's a plateau.
Plateau. It is sitting upon a plateau. So you have a little bit of a hard time for a river running through a plateau. But even if we're going to just say, okay, the river did this, the Colorado River carved this into the top of the plateau until it gets to the formation that it is now, where did the 5.5 trillion cubic yards of sedimentation go? And this is a question science didn't have an answer for. 2021, they have surmised an answer. The sea ate it. And I say that a little bit jokingly, but in their words, not mine, in a catastrophic event, the formation of Rodinia, is that the, familiar with that one? I'm not going to look it up, we're out of time. But as the landmass Rodinia was being broken apart, all of the sedimentation from the Colorado River that had washed out of the Grand Canyon was pulled into the Pacific Ocean. Again, if that sedimentation was dispersed across the earth, it gives you an answer for where that sedimentation may have went. Last one is the Mississippi River. If the earth was as old as it is, the 300 million cubic yards of sedimentation that the Mississippi River deposits into the Gulf of Mexico would have long ago filled it up. We would not have a Gulf of Mexico. We would have Texas would fight with it. I'm sure they'd get it. And the question is, well, the answer is, not sublimation. We talked about the other day. Subduction. Subduction is the answer here. Subduction is estimated to only, did I have this one written down? No, I didn't. Subduction is estimated to only account for about 1 million tons of sediment being taken back into the earth a year. It's nowhere near enough to deal with all of that.
And be near a subduction zone for that to happen.
And be near a subduction
Gulf of
zone.
Mexico is in the middle of the North American tectonic plate, so that
Doesn't fit.
it doesn't fit.
All right, guys, it's on Sunday. John Moore is going to come and speak to us about ancient cities. I'm very much looking forward to that. Thank you all so much for your comments.